All right, ladies and gents, welcome to the very last note set of Unit 6. This is the World War II notes. So again, you want to make sure that you're all ready and set to take notes, everything away except the note sheet if you have it out yourself. If you did, go ahead and print the note sheet out. One thing that you might have noticed is that, there's that one, is that this is a really long note set. If you take a look at all the slides here, it goes from 1 all the way down to 108. And this is actually a slightly shorter version of the notes than we work from sometimes. So it's a long note set. World War II is a very major turning point. So I'm going to be jumping around a little bit. There's some things that are on here that I won't emphasize as much because they're fairly well covered in your textbook or because they're sort of de-emphasized in the College Board's curriculum. And so the years that I have up here, 1939 to 1945, which you see on the slide, right? This is 1939 is when World War II starts in Europe with the invasion of Poland, September 1st, 1939. And 1945, of course, is when it ends, dropping the atomic bomb. But in order to talk about the actual war itself, we do have to go backwards a bit into the 1930s, a little 1920s, but especially into the 1930s to talk about the lead up to the war. We're actually going to spend a fair amount of time on lead up to the war and how the United States foreign policy sort of changes over time as we get closer and closer to becoming involved in the war itself. We'll skip kind of lightly over the fighting of the war. We'll look a little more intently at the home front, how the war impacts the United States here at home, and then especially at the aftermath of the war, the various conferences that come out of the war, the redrawing of Europe, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's where we are heading. All right, so World War II, road to war. So I'd say the 1920s and 1930s, where we have spent talking about what's going on in the United States. We've had Roaring Twenties, we've had Flackers, we've had nativism, right? We've had the Great Depression, obviously. While all that's been going on in the United States, in Europe, mostly what's been happening politically is the buildup of a set of totalitarian or like dictatorship-oriented type countries. So this word totalitarian or totalitarianism, you're going to see this a couple times. It's just sort of a synonym for a dictatorship. It's a government or a type of government where all of the power is in the hands of one person or one entity. Sometimes a similar word that we're going to see here is the word fascist, F-A-S-C-I-S-T, which I'll also sometimes refer to as statist, and that's a government that's solely focused around like the good of the state, the good of the collective rather than on individual rights. And so the governments that in the 20s and 30s are building up these sort of totalitarian, like dictator-led, very like state-focused and anti-individualist regimes are Japan, the Soviet Union, Italy, and Germany. And both Japan and Italy were former allies, right? If you go back, if we rewind back, 20, 25 years to World War I, what we see is the two of them on the Allied side. The Soviet Union has like a little bit of a mixed record there, right? Having been an ally in World War I and then pulled out when the Russian Revolution happened. And Germany, of course, is our sort of longtime antagonist. Over on the side of isolation and appeasement, we see Great Britain and France and the United States, sort of the remnants of the Allied alliance from World War I. The other really big word that you definitely need to know to talk about the period before World War II is this word here, appeasement. And appeasement means giving in to someone sort of like just to make them go away. So giving in to demands in hopes of sort of stopping like aggression. So the pattern that we're going to see in the 1930s as we build up towards World War II is aggression on the part of one of the totalitarian dictatorships, mostly Germany, but some of the others too. They're going to aggress, they're going to take land, or they're going to break a treaty or whatever it is. And then the Great Britain, France in particular, what they're going to respond with is appeasement. Like, oh, okay, well, just this one time, but don't do it again. So that's sort of the pattern that we're going to see developing here. If you take a look at the next few slides on here, you will see some notes on the development of each of these totalitarian dictatorships. There's a couple of things that I want to highlight. I already mentioned that Japan had previously been an allied power, but is developing into, the best way to really think about what's going on in Japan here is that Japan is striving to become imperialist, much in the same way that the United States did, like back around the time of the Spanish-American War. The problem from our perspective is that they're seeking to become imperialist in area or in territory that's already been claimed. So like you remember, the United States owns and controls the Philippines, right? This is a United States colony at this point in time. This is Japan right up here in the red. So what Japan is interested in doing is expanding outside of itself to take over more territory and gain more natural resources, things of that nature. And we, in the Japanese eyes, we are very seen as being very hypocritical when we kind of push back when they take over land like this area of Manchuria here, etc. The first thing that Japan does that brings this attitude towards our attention is their attack into Manchuria. Manchuria is this northern area of China. It's gone back and forth in ownership a couple times. It was like, controlled by the Mongols for a while, etc. But it's been part of China for a while at this point. And the Japanese army is going to invade it very harshly in 1931. And pretty much from here on out, from this 1931 invasion of Manchuria onward, Japan and China are essentially at war from here, 1931, all the way until the end of World War II in 1945. So what we think of as like a 5 or 6 year war, World War II, in Asia, it's really a decade-long war. At the latest, we're in full bore, like full-out fighting between Japan and China by 1937, with the invasion into like sort of they're going to make this swoop down here and come down towards like Shanghai. And so that's in 1937, but even as early as 1931, Japan and China are really engaged. And that's important because we'll look at like, well, why does Pearl Harbor happen? Why does Japan decide to attack the United States? And part of the answer is that they've just been fighting for so long at that time that they almost don't have a choice. Like they have to. So that's Japan. Germany, we all sort of know that. I will point out that this 1932, the same year that Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany, is also the same year that FDR is elected for the first time. So at the same time as FDR is rolling out New Deal plans, right, to try to bring the United States out of the Great Depression, what Hitler is doing to try to bring Germany out of their own Great Depression is basically going to be remilitarizing. And so there are a subset of people in the United States and elsewhere who look at Hitler and say, well, I don't know, maybe some of the stuff he says is kind of crazy, but like he's getting stuff done. Germany is coming out of the Depression. They're building tanks, they're building roads, right? That people have jobs. So Hitler rises to power in the same atmosphere that produces a lot of radical ideas in the United States. It's just different radical, as that makes sense. By the time we get about 1935, he's completely given up really any pretense of like a democratic system. He's taken the label Führer, and we're starting to really see some very ugly and very heavy anti-Semitism rolling out of Germany by about 1935, 1936, the latest. Meanwhile, previously, actually, as early as 1922, Italy had been experiencing the rise of a fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini. Mussolini and Hitler are going to be kind of buds. I mean, I think as much as anybody can be friends with Hitler, they're sort of very similar in their worldview. They're going to form an early alliance. We call them the Axis powers because if you can visualize a map of Europe and you think about where Germany and Italy is, if you connect them, they make like an axis, right, a straight up and down line through the middle of Europe. That's where that term comes from. And Mussolini is at the head of a fascist party. So this is when we first start to see this word. So the term fascist, it's from the Italian Latinate for facere, which means like a bundle of sticks. And so the imagery there is that if you take one stick, if you can just imagine like a single stick, you can snap it pretty easily, right? Because it's all by itself. But if you take a bundle of sticks, if you bundle 20 sticks together, you can't snap them anymore. They are stronger together. So the idea of the fascist party is like complete unity and like subsuming of the individual under the state or the collective. So it's turning away from like civil rights or individual rights and towards like the power of the state. And so in the United States, so when you read like American history, primary source documents, we just come to use fascism as like a general catch-all term for all of these other dictatorships. So we're going to call like, Hitler's Nazism a fascist dictatorship. And when eventually we get to communism, we talk about like Stalin as a fascist dictatorship. So a lot of times you'll see World War II, again, from the U.S. perspective, framed as a fight between like democracy and fascism. And that's what it means. It's this sort of state first, again, dictatorship headed, like really anti-individualistic type of political philosophy. Meanwhile, and in a place that we're going to find hard to categorize, we have this, of course, Joseph Stalin, old ruler of the Soviet Union. It's sort of original premier, Vladimir Lenin. He dies in 24. There's a brief period of instability while they try to figure out who's going to come out on top. And the person who emerges at the top of the heap is Joseph Stalin, man of steel. And he's going to be in charge these years down here. This is the years that he's in charge of the Soviet Union. So it's like 30 years, 1924, 1953. He's been around for a long time. And we're going to have a very mixed relationship with Stalin. This is going to prove to be a fairly strong ally for the U.S. during World War II, largely because Stalin and Hitler really hate each other. That's a very, that sounds like a maybe kind of a throwaway type thing, but it's actually really important for the way that World War II plays out. The two of them don't like each other personally, and to us, it seems like communism and Nazism may seem like fairly similar. You've got one guy in charge, they treat their people badly, there's a lot of problems with anti-Semitism, etc. But the two of them see their political systems as complete opposites. And Nazism and statism, fascism, right, that's all the way on the right side of the political spectrum, very conservative, right, state first. Whereas communism on paper anyway is purely about the individual, right? It's all about sort of individualism, and it's very far on the left side of the political spectrum. So again, even though they present very similarly in terms of what the government looks like, ideologically they're very different, and there's not going to be they don't get along real well. Okay? So here's where we are at circa 1935-36, if you will forgive my extremely poor MS Paint Photoshop job on this particular map here. I apologize for that. But again, all the countries in blue, that's our Axis alliance. Then you can see that straight line right there. And then this is the remnants of our allies, Great Britain and France, fairly solidly, and the Soviet Union kind of, we assume. It looks fairly balanced, right? That's not, never like to have Nazis in the center of everything, but in general, this is manageable, right? It's sort of surrounded. We've got two balanced out alliances. So the problems start in 1935. Germany is going to start to make some aggressive moves. The first thing that they're going to do is break directly with the Treaty of Versailles. If you remember, one of the things the Treaty of Versailles said was that Germany had to completely disarm. It had to, cut down its army, its navy, etc. So here in 1935, as part of, supposedly as part of a measure of bringing Germany out of the Depression, the Nazi government is going to break with that, and Britain and France don't do anything, right? They're just kind of like, oh, well, yeah, that's a thing you weren't supposed to do. So it's a good example of what we're going to see, this pattern of aggression and appeasement. Mussolini attacks Ethiopia in 1935, again, taking territory that he's really not supposed to be taking. The British Prime Minister is this dude over here with the lovely little mustache. That's Neville Chamberlain, and he's going to become kind of famous for these appeasement policies. He's really genuinely trying very hard just to avoid war here. Chamberlain's going to get a bad historical rap, but it's not that he's some complete and utter moron. He just sort of fails to recognize a lot of the signs and wants very deeply and passionately to keep Great Britain out of war, a thing that a lot of British people wanted to. In 1936, we take a look at sort of where's the United States at in all of this. The United States is still very isolationist. 36, remember, is when FDR gets reelected. This is his second election, so this is the one that comes on the back of the Second New Deal and is in response to all of the radicalism, right? And kind of in the middle of that, he gives a speech called the I Hate War speech. I'm pretty sure you guys can make an educated guess at what the I Hate War speech is about. It's FDR essentially proclaiming that he hates war, and that the United States will avoid war. It's a very sort of isolationist-y flavored speech. And that same year, and kind of as a result, Congress is going to put out this report called the Nye Committee report that basically blames U.S. bankers and business interests for the U.S. entry into World War I. So it says essentially that even though Woodrow Wilson said we were going to war to make the world safe for democracy, in reality, according to the Nye Committee, what was going on behind the scenes was that bankers and businessmen were pulling the strings to try to get the U.S. to go to war so they could make profit. It's a very cynical and probably not very accurate, again, from modern day perspective type report. And it's going to really color American political opinion about whether or not we should get involved in the war. You guys should have hopefully started to pick up from your reading that the American public overall in the 1930s does not want to get involved in Europe. Very much majority American opinion is we'll just let them fight it out, not our problem, not our problem. And one of the things that fuels that is this Nye Committee report, which makes it seem to a lot of people like the last war we got involved in was almost like a mistake, or we were manipulated into it. So that's sort of where the U.S. is at circa 1936. Remember, again, the 1937 recession that happened, that was the sort of blip right after Roosevelt's reelection to the second term. We talked about that a bit in the New Deal thing. So that's another thing that continues to make us think let's just deal with our own stuff, right? And you can really see that reflected in the passage in 1935, 36, and 37. We passed three separate acts, but they all basically say the same thing, these neutrality acts. So these are passed by the U.S. Congress in 3 successive years. And what they say is that if there is a foreign war, so again, very hypothetical, if there is a foreign war, then the U.S. is not allowed to sell any weapons or loan any money to any belligerent means argumentative or fighting. So basically to any countries that are at war. So as soon as war happens, we can't sell anything or loan money to anybody who's at war. Any non-military goods those countries want, they have to be purchased on a cash and carry basis. That means what it sounds like. It means other countries have to send their ships to us, and they have to pay up front, no loans. Like, we won't, sell you stuff on credit. Americans can't travel on any ships of nations that are at war. And then the 1937 one's going to be involved in the Spanish Civil War, and we'll talk about that in another slide here in just a sec. So basically what the Neutrality Acts, these three Neutrality Acts, tell us is that in the 1930s, we basically knew that war was coming, right? Because you don't pass a law that says if a foreign war occurs unless you think there's a pretty good chance a foreign war might occur. So we knew that war was probably on the horizon, and we're like doubling down on this idea of isolationism and on the idea of not getting involved. The Spanish Civil War that was mentioned in the 37 Neutrality Act, this is a little kind of a minor side note, but an important one. What's going on in Spain is that you have the conflict between the sort of leftist, democratic-ish Spanish Republic that's in power versus a big-time general of the Spanish army named Francisco Franco, who's a fascist. That's what you think about him. He is a fascist. He's a nationalist. And so for 36 to 39, it's like Franco versus the government. It would be like if, I don't even know, Petraeus or something like that, right? And you arrange some sort of large-scale rebellion against the U.S. government. And many in the United States, people who were interventionist and thought the U.S. should be more involved, saw the Spanish Civil War as like a front against fascism. Franco is supported directly by both Mussolini and Hitler. At one point in time, they're going to use their planes to do some civilian bombings, those types of things. Franco is eventually going to win these dates that you see up here, 39 to 75. That's how long Francisco Franco is in charge of Spain, from 1939 until he dies in 1975. It's one of the longest ruling leaders in the modern world. And if Spain is going to remain neutral but kind of fascist allied during World War II. So this is a good, once people talk about the spread of fascism, or fascism is starting to take hold across Europe, Spain is another area where we see that happening. So some people in the United States look at the Spanish Civil War and look at the troubling things that are going on in Germany and Italy and in Russia, or excuse me, the Soviet Union, and they say, hey, we really should be getting involved in this, right? We need to take some action. We're not going to be protected by this barrier of the Atlantic Ocean for too long. All of those, sort of diseases are going to creep over to us. This is Dr. Seuss, of course, characteristic, was a political cartoonist during the war. And so there are certainly people, FDR among them, who believe that the United States should be getting more involved, but the vast majority of people in the United States are isolationist. And so, of course, when the vast majority of people are isolationist, that means Congress is too. I have a couple of examples of reasons why someone might be isolationist up here. Some of them are genuine, people who just don't like war, people who think World War I was awful and we shouldn't do it again. But there is some sort of ugly stuff lurking underneath some of this isolationism as well. There are a fair amount of people in the U.S., people with ties to Germany or some of those governments, or just people who support them, who just really think that the fascist states kind of have it right. That they're a protection against communism, that, maybe Jewish people really are behind a lot of the causes. Anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is very widespread and has been throughout a lot of European history. And so there, in the late 1930s, a group of people formed this America First Committee, which is Charles Lindbergh's the most prominent member. That's him right there getting his sword from Nazi leader Hermann Göring. And what the America First Committee was all about, it's exactly what the name sounds like. It was a sort of nationalist, isolationist committee that promoted the interests of America first, and that we should just sort of stay out of European affairs and just sort of let the Germans do what they're going to do, basically. A little bit ugly connotation. 1937, right around the time that a lot of this stuff is brewing, Spanish Civil War is underway, et cetera, Roosevelt gives, he's president for ever, so he gives a lot of famous speeches, but this is definitely a big one. It's called the quarantine speech. And if you think about what quarantine means, it's this idea that when you have someone who is sick, when you have a group of people or a person who is sick, that you sort of want to isolate them and keep them away from everyone else to stop that sickness from spreading. And so what Roosevelt does in this quarantine speech is he compares fascism kind of indirectly, and more specifically war, to a disease. War is a contagion, and that we, the United States, don't want to get involved in war, says Roosevelt, but we should have policies that act to like restrict or restrain the spread of war and the spread of fascism. And what the quarantine speech is often taken to be by historians who study this kind of thing is an example of, or a sign of, how much more interventionist Roosevelt is than the rest of the country. So like, this is a Rooseveltian slide. This is like where the rest of the country is. So from 37 until the U.S. finally does join the war in 1941, one of the kind of stories of this road to the war period is the way that FDR is trying to, sometimes subtly and sometimes not so subtly, kind of push the United States towards more involvement. Not so much necessarily towards war, but towards being more like supportive of the Allies and more restrictive of the Germans. Of course, you know, there's only so much that the president can do, no matter how much power he has, if Congress is not with him. And that's the situation that Roosevelt finds himself in here. Okay. Meanwhile, in Asia, where we haven't been talking about in a little while, in December of 1937, the Japanese army is going to surge out of Manchuria, which it's been occupying for about 5 years or so now, 5.5 years, and it's going to swing down, like I mentioned, sort of into the heart of China, near where some of the center of governance is. So Nanjing, or it was called Nanking at the time, is a largish civilian city that's invaded by Japanese troops in December of 1937, and the city and the civilians there are just treated with an enormous amount of brutality. All of the like firsthand reports that come out of it detail some really terrible atrocities. This is the beginning of full-out war between the Chinese government, such as it exists after this, and the Japanese military. The estimate, like if you take a look at this estimate that I have down the bottom of the slide, you'll notice how varied that is. The Japanese government at the end of the war is going to admit to 40,000 civilian deaths in Nanjing. At the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, they claim about 200,000, and then 300,000 claimed by the Chinese government. So there's a really wide stretch here. Numbers, everything that I've looked at suggests that the correct number is closer to the higher end of that spectrum. It's just a tremendous amount of people killed, really awful pillaging. It's called the rape of Nanjing in a symbolic way, but there is a tremendous amount of actual rape as well. It's just very much the definition of what we would call war crimes perpetrated by the Japanese army on the Chinese civilians. So here's where we're at back in Europe in 1937. And this is where we're going to start to see kind of the beginning of the advance of the German army. I'm going to click through this relatively quickly because, again, less relevant for U.S. purposes. But basically what we're going to start to see here, and again, my sad little MS Paint photo job here, is the taking of various territory by the German army. So in 36, they're going to roll into the Rhineland kind of as a test case, like see what happens. Is anyone going to stop us? Turns out the answer is no. And so the next year, in March of 1938, they're going to roll into Austria. They call the invasion of Austria the Anschluss. It's a word that basically means homecoming. And Hitler himself is from Austria. He was born in Austria. And a lot of the people in Austria are ethnically German. Austria-Hungary had been allied with Germany during World War II. So they make, during World War I. So they make the argument that this is just sort of like it's not really a invasion, it's more just, a rejoining of territories and peoples who are sort of similar. And that's true for a fairly big chunk of the Austrian population. When Hitler rolls into Vienna, into the capital city, he's greeted with people throwing flowers at his car, like there's this big sort of victory processional. Of course, the Jewish population of Austria feels considerably differently about this, and as do some others who weren't in favor of the German policies, but they are sort of overwhelmed. And this is a relatively a bloodless coup here in Austria for the most part. There's almost no resistance to the Nazi occupation. The next target of the German war machine, since Austria goes so well, is they basically decide to take Czechoslovakia as well. If you take a look at this sort of weird little shape here, that's Czechoslovakia, or that was Czechoslovakia, and you can kind of see that this part of it right here is sort of surrounded by Germany. And so this part of Czechoslovakia, which Hitler just made up the term Sudetenland to talk about it like it was a separate area, that part of Czechoslovakia does actually have a lot of Germans in it. And so in that part of Czechoslovakia, there's some eagerness or some willingness for reconciliation with Germany, but this whole part here, the entire rest of the country, is made up of people who were considered ethnically inferior by the Germans. So there's the Slavic people, there's some Czech people, there's a few other groups going on. There's a pretty big Roma community in that area as well. And none of those people are super happy about this whole thing. So there actually is some resistance in Czechoslovakia. And this is where finally we're going to see Great Britain and, well, France as well, but especially Great Britain start to try to step in a little. So in September of 1938, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is going to fly to Munich to meet with Hitler. There's actually a couple meetings. This September 1938 one is the final one. And he's going to get this agreement called the Munich Agreement. A bunch of countries signed to it, and what it says is Germany will be allowed to retake Czechoslovakia. So yay, they get to take Czechoslovakia. And in exchange, here's our appeasement, that Germany is just going to promise not to do this anymore. They're going to promise that this is like the last step, the last thing that they want. And of course, in hindsight, that's an easy thing to laugh at, but poor Chamberlain was very optimistic. This photo at the bottom here, this is him arriving back in London after signing the Munich Agreement. You can see him right there. That's him in the center, and what he's holding in his hand holding up in the air, that's the Munich Agreement, and he has the very famous quote where he says, "I hold in my hand the pride of secured peace in our time," right? And just very optimistic about the fact that he has sort of stopped or halted the march towards war in Central Europe. Poor Chamberlain is largely being deceived. In summer of 1939, we don't have the date up here, but we should, let's say like June. That's probably wrong, but sometime in the summer of 1939, something big is going to happen that really should have scared more people than it did, and that is that Hitler and Stalin, surprisingly, are going to sign what's called the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. So this is not a treaty. That's a pretty important thing. This is not an alliance. It's not them saying, you know, I got your back and I'll fight with you and you fight with me. What it is the two countries saying, I won't fight directly against you and you won't fight directly against me. And what that allows both of them to do is a pretty large land grab in this whole sort of white area in between them. Both Stalin and Hitler are greedy for land. They both want to take over territory. I believe they deserve and need to take over territory. And what this is going to allow them to do is almost like take a pause from being aggressive at each other to just like land grab whatever they can. From this, the signing of this pact for about the next year and a half is just an enormous land grab, especially on the part of the Soviet Union, but also on Germany's part as well. This is bad for, well, really everyone, but certainly the forces of good in our battle here, right? Because if you take a look at the map, right, it's tilted enormously towards what used to seem like a fairly balanced map, like we got them surrounded. Now it looks a lot more dangerous, correctly. So the final straw for Chamberlain and for the rest of non-Nazi Europe is going to come with the German invasion of Poland in 1939. If I sort of flip back and forth between the two of these, you can kind of see what's going on here. Like basically in September of 1939, the Nazis are going to move to invade Poland at about the same time. The Soviets are going to kind of come in from the east. Poland gets sort of swallowed up. It takes about a month for Poland, and this finally is going to be the last straw. So German tanks and troops roll into Poland in a style of warfare called blitzkrieg, which means like a fast, hard, all-at-once strike. And Britain and France declare war on Germany, and World War II is officially begun. Meanwhile, what's the United States up to? We are signing a neutrality act. So it's sort of what we do best here. There's a couple of really key differences between this 39 Neutrality Act and then the other three that we sort of talked about as a group. And so what this one does, this 1939 Neutrality Act, it does a couple things really important here. Number one, it says that we originally said we won't sell any weapons or loan any money to any belligerent country. Well, this says we won't sell weapons to European democracies, so meaning Britain and France, on a cash and carry basis, yes, but we will sell them weapons, which is new. It also specifically labels the Axis powers as the aggressors in the war, and that says that they're not allowed to send any ships to the U.S. to buy war goods. And it makes the United States into this phrase that's bolded at the bottom here is pretty important. It creates the United States as like the place where the democracies of the world sort of buy their weaponry, and it's going to effectively bring the U.S. out of the Great Depression. Between this and then the Lend-Lease Act that we'll talk about in 41, those two things combined basically bring the U.S. out of the Great Depression. It's worth noting that if you take a look at what's going on here, that this is a neutrality act that's not at all neutral, right? Neutrality means you're not taking a side one way or another, but what we're saying here is that we will sell weapons to the democracies and the Axis are the bad guys, right? That's not a neutral stance. So what it is we're sort of in a position that's gotten us into trouble before, where we're saying that we are neutral except like we favor these guys, right? You're the good guys, you're the bad guys. So we don't have an alliance or anything like that, but to me, this is a far from neutral stance, and that's pretty important. And that is, as the slide says, largely because of FDR's influence. Okay. So before the United States, World War II, there's a couple of things going on. This just talks a little bit about Blitzkrieg and the general invasion. There's some interesting stuff in here, but this is like more European history. Largely what you need to know is that France, unfortunately, is going to be the next target of the Germans. They're going to swing in through, supposedly, well, through neutral Belgium and make it not neutral Belgium. And unfortunately for the French, they're going to dodge around the French defenses fairly easily. And they're going to take Paris within about 3.5, 4 weeks. So the Blitzkrieg begins on May 10th, and then France surrenders, June 25th. So that's like a month and a half later. France, for most of the rest of the war until D-Day, is going to be divided into 3 zones: the German-occupied zone, and then the quote-unquote free zone is called Vichy France, because the capital was Vichy, which is right there. It's free in the sense that it wasn't like directly occupied, but it's basically a puppet state. So that's sort of what's going on in France. That's a pretty big blow, because that leaves the literal only country fighting against Germany. If you take a look at the map that we've got here, everything that's in blue is either German owned, German allied, or German conquered. So like you can see France over there. Everything in green is either the Soviet Union or conquered by the Soviet Union. So you can see they've made a bunch of inroads into like former Poland, all the Baltic states. They're like coming in on Finland up here, heading down in the direction of like Turkey and towards Greece, etc. And so the cheese that stands alone is basically Great Britain, Iceland, yes, but as you might imagine, not really the best of helps in terms of militarily. So that's what we're left with. And so if you take a look at this image, and if you think, like if you were Hitler, which I'm assuming that none of you are, what your maneuver would be, tactically, you've kind of only got one of 2 things you could do. You could try to invade by sea, or you could try to invade by air. Great Britain hasn't been successfully invaded by sea since 1066, when William the Conqueror took it. So air invasion is going to be the way that the Germans go. This is the Blitz, right, the Battle of Great Britain, where we see a tremendous amount of civilian bombing. Over 40,000 civilians killed, as the slide notes down there at the bottom. And this is like the part of the war where Great Britain is sort of the loneliest, as it were. They're pretty much directly under attack from the Germans. Lots of air raids over German cities, a lot of bombings of London, etc. And it's during this period that the United States is going to step up even further, like past that Neutrality Act of 39, now that France is gone, and they're going to pass this Lend-Lease Act. This is a really big piece of legislation. It's come up very frequently on the AP exam in the past. It's a good one to know. And so what this says is that any country whose security is vital to U.S. interest, which is just a coded way of saying Great Britain, right, can get arms and equipment by sale, transfer, or lease. So no more cash and carry. We will actually loan or lease you stuff, Great Britain, because we are sort of terrified of the Nazis. So you can see that this is the end result at the end of the war. Great Britain by far receiving the most, the Soviet Union. France a little bit after D-Day. So once that goes on, and then our other allies as well. I have no idea what was going on in South America. Lots of warfare at sea as well. The Battle of the Atlantic does. Once we start to put our ships out and we're selling, things as a result of Lend-Lease, that's going to put us into contact with German U-boats. That's not going to go very well, as it did not in World War I. And finally, in June of 1941, something that's going to prove to be a pretty big turning point is going to happen. Number one, notice that the Germans have invaded up north and down south like pretty considerably since last time we saw this. And by this point, they're going to decide Hitler specifically, is going to decide to break that Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact that he had set up and to invade the Soviet Union. As far as why you would do this, I think both Hitler and Stalin know that the pact's not going to hold forever. They hate each other, right? And now they're right on each other's border. So someone is going to have to break it first. And Hitler just basically decides in June of 1941 that the time is now and that he's going to be the person who breaks it first. So the German army is going to march over sort of through Poland and inward towards the Soviet Union. And this area over here, this is going to be called the Eastern Front. We won't talk about it much because there's basically no U.S. involvement over there, but it is the deadliest and the site of some of the worst atrocities of World War II. If you look at where did the most civilians die, it's on the Eastern Front. Where were the most bombings on the Eastern Front? It's just a horrific series of battles. The Battle of Stalingrad, the siege of Leningrad, long winters with people starving to death, and I mean it's really, really awful. If you ever look at casualty numbers, they're just staggering over in that side of things. So the German army is now split, right, between the sort of fighting over here and then presumably keeping an eye on Great Britain. And that creates a two-front war, and that's never a good situation. Right around the time that this happens, and I think largely because it happens, FDR and Churchill are going to have a secret meeting. And at the secret meeting, they're going to sign a document called the Atlantic Charter. It's going to basically form the beginnings of talks for what's going to become the United Nations. It's got a lot of the same language as Wilson's 14 points. Remember that the United States never signed on to the League of Nations, so this is fairly significant here. This is not an alliance. We're not allied yet. This is August of 1941, but Pearl Harbor hasn't happened. But it's a pretty strong statement of unity and of sort of working towards common goals. I personally think that this is about the time when Roosevelt just decides, like, well, we are going to get into this at some point. This is like a little bit of a YOLO move to me on FDR's part, not to put too fine a point on it. This is sort of when he I think mentally knows that they're not going to be able to back away from war no matter what happens. Well, in the realm of no matter what happens, meanwhile, back on the farm, Japan has been further aggressing into some various regions, right? They've got this kind of whole area here is all occupied territory, same as Manchuria. They're already occupying Korea. They have been for quite a while. And now they're looking, again, they've been at war solidly since 1937 and to some extent since 31. And so they're starting to run out of stuff. They need more rubber, they need oil, they need all of those kinds of things you need to make war goods go. So they're starting to invade down into some of these colonies. This is mostly like a little bit British, but mostly Dutch down here. And it's very close to the U.S.-owned Philippines, right? And so that's obviously a major concern. And so the Japanese high command knows if they start to move into this area, which they need to do and want to do, that the United States is going to take that as a threat, right? If they're invading countries right next to the Philippines, we're going to take that as a threat. We're going to wind up getting involved. Also, a lot of this stuff over here is U.S. controlled, right? The Marshall Islands and things like that. So the Japanese high command makes kind of a similar calculation to the one that Hitler made in invading the Soviet Union and says, you know what, we're going to strike first. And that, of course, is Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese fleet is going to roll in off of aircraft carriers and stage an early morning attack. It's like a little before 8 in the morning on a Sunday. The United States Navy has done something that they're actually not allowed to do right now, and they have parked a really big percentage of their fleet at Pearl Harbor. I feel like this is not an exact number, so don't quote me on this, but it's something like about 90% of the U.S. naval fleet is parked at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. We don't do that anymore for obvious reasons. And so what that means, though, is that the Japanese attack is going to be fairly effective. As you can see from the statistics on the slide, it's a bunch of battleships that are sunk. This sort of center gray thing here, this is the Naval Air Station where a big bunch of planes were parked. They were worried about sabotage, so instead of parking them all spread out like they normally would, they had parked them all in a little bunch in the center so they could be more easily guarded. Of course, that means that a few planes with bombs are going to swipe right over and blast out a whole bunch of our aircraft. You can see the damage there is pretty enormous. And when the smoke clears at the end of the attack, a little bit under 2,500 Americans are killed, 50 civilians, and then largely military personnel, mostly Navy, naval shipmen who were on board ships that were hit, direct hit or sunk, like in the case of the USS Arizona. So this, of course, immediately arouses the anger of the United States civilian population. Roosevelt is going to get on the radio that day, that afternoon. He gives his war speech, which is also very famous, right? He talks about the United States having been suddenly and deliberately attacked by the nation of Japan, talks about December 7th as a day which will live in infamy, and then asks Congress to declare war, which they very quickly are going to do. It's not a unanimous declaration, but it's pretty close. And it's worth noting while we're here that this is the last time in American history that the Congress is going to declare war. Every war we've fought since then has not been an actual congressionally declared war. It's been a military action of some sort. So the United States enters into the war itself, right? We're in War II fighting here in a two-front war, and that is where we'll pick up with the next section of notes the next time that we are together. Thank you guys for your attention.